Hello again, feral friends and fellow nature nerds. For today's episode, we're going to go back to birds. Specifically, a couple of birds that you're likely to see, especially this time of year, if you put out a bird feeder. But first I want to say a couple of words about bird feeders. Believe it or not, there's some debate about putting out bird feeders. There's a school of thought that feeding any wild animal, which includes birds, is bad. Now, because feeders do tend to be a place where birds congregate, putting them in closer proximity to each other than they might otherwise get, it does make it possible for them to more easily transmit diseases. Opponents of feeders would say you should just plant native flowers and trees to attract birds to your yard, which is not a bad idea, even if you do have a bird feeder up. If you do choose to hang a feeder, and for the record, I do have one, the best way to reduce the risk to the birds is to clean and disinfect your feeder regularly, every couple of weeks, and pay attention to local alerts from experts. If there's something going around your area, they might recommend that you take down your feeders for a while. But a common myth about bird feeders is that if you start feeding the birds, they'll come to depend on your feeder, and then you have to continue indefinitely, or the poor helpless little birdies will starve. And let me tell you, that's just not the case. Birds are perfectly capable of finding other food sources if you forget to fill your feeder or if you take a trip to Florida during the wintertime. Overall, it's my personal opinion that having a bird feeder out does more good than harm. It's a way for people, especially those in more urban areas, to observe and appreciate wildlife, wild birds, which will make them more likely to take an interest in protecting the birds and the ecosystems that they depend on. So let's take a look at a couple of birds that might visit your feeder, chickadees and nuthatches. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. Neither chickadees nor nuthatches are migratory, although some nuthatches do go on vacation, but we'll talk about that later. For the most part, throughout their ranges, they stick around, even though in many parts of their ranges, winter temperatures can routinely get well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you live in North America and you have a bird feeder out, it's likely that you've had one or both of these birds come to visit. There's 7 species of chickadee. Gray-headed chickadees are found primarily in the subarctic regions of northern Europe, parts of Alaska, and far northwestern Canada. Boreal chickadees in the boreal forests of the northernmost U.S. and Canada. Carolina chickadees are found in the southeastern United States, with the exception of the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains. Chestnut-backed chickadees live in the Pacific Northwest. Mountain chickadees, as their name suggests, in the Rocky Mountain region. Mexican chickadees, unsurprisingly, live primarily in Mexico throughout their range, although it extends up into southern Arizona and New Mexico. But the black-capped chickadee is the one most widely distributed in North America, and the primary species that I'm going to be talking about today. They're found in the northern half of the United States, up into Canada, and from coast to coast. And really, except for some fairly minor differences in plumage and maybe some regional adaptive behavior, all chickadees share pretty much the same characteristics. According to the Cornell Labs All About Birds website, black-capped chickadees are, and I quote, universally considered to be cute because of their big round head and tiny body. And I can't disagree there. It also helps their image that they're curious about everything, including humans. Their habit of investigating people and everything else in their home territory, and the speed with which they discover bird feeders means they're one of the first birds many aspiring birders see and learn about. They're very distinctive, tiny birds with a black cap and bib, white cheeks, and the slate-gray wings and tail. Black-capped chickadees are cavity nesters, which, like I've said many times before, is why standing dead trees are important. They'll use abandoned downy woodpecker cavities, or a lot of times excavate their own. They'll also use nesting boxes, but interestingly, they seem to prefer to excavate wood shavings or sawdust rather than to take over an empty box. I would guess because it makes it seem more like a natural cavity. So if you're putting up a nesting box hoping to attract chickadees, putting some sawdust or wood shavings inside will increase the chances of getting chickadees to move in. The nesting site is usually selected by the female, and both sexes help excavate the cavity. Once the nest chamber is hollowed out, the female builds a cup-shaped nest inside, using moss or other coarse material for the foundation, and, according to all the sources I read, lining it with softer material like rabbit fur. But where chickadees source their rabbit fur, I don't know. Now, chickadees are social birds and they live in flocks, but these flocks are often made up of more than just chickadees. Other birds like woodpeckers, nuthatches, warblers, vireos, and other small woodland birds will join chickadee flocks to form a mixed species flock. Nature's own DEI. Don't tell the government. In fact, since small songbirds migrating through an unfamiliar area will often associate with chickadee flocks, watching and listening for chickadees during spring and fall especially can often alert astute birders to the presence of an interesting migrant. Winter flocks, with chickadees as the nucleus, contain various mated chickadee pairs and non-breeders, but generally not the offspring of the adult pairs that are part of that flock. Now, within the flock, there's a dominance hierarchy. Some birds are what's called winter floaters. They don't belong to a single flock. And these individuals may have different ranks within each flock that they spend time in. Chickadees have two main calls. One is called a phoebe call, usually heard first thing in the morning. The other is the call that they're named for, which sounds like they're saying Chicka-dee-dee-dee. But these calls are actually fairly complex and language-like, communicating information on identity and recognition of other flocks, as well as predator alarms and contact calls. Studies have shown that the more Ds in a chickadee's call, the bigger the threat. A really big threat, like a Cooper's hawk, can elicit as many as 22 Ds. And most of the birds that associate with chickadee flocks will respond to the chickadee's alarm call, even if their own species doesn't have a similar alarm call. Now, chickadees might visit your feeder year-round, but one of the reasons I wanted to talk about chickadees today in the middle of winter is because you're more likely to see them at your feeder in the winter. In the spring, summer, and fall, insects, spiders, and other animal matter make up 80 to 90% of their diet. In the winter, when obviously these things are less available, their diet changes so that it's about half seeds, berries, and other plant matter, and half animal matter like insects or larvae, if they can find them, suet, and sometimes even scavenging fat and meat from carcasses. In addition to suet, at feeders they prefer sunflower seeds, peanuts or peanut butter, and mealworms. Now, chickadees will cache food, mostly seeds, but sometimes insects too. Items are stored singly in a variety of places like under bark, under dead leaves, conifer needle clusters, or in a knothole. The chickadee can remember thousands of these cache sites for about a month, and for the first day or so, they even remember the relative quality of the cached item. Because of this caching behavior, chickadees have a larger hippocampus, the part of the brain involved in memory, than other caching birds in their family. And black-capped chickadees specifically have a larger hippocampus than other chickadees. And not only that, but there's even a variation in size within the black-capped chickadee population based on the region where they live. Chickadees living in harsher climates like Alaska have larger hippocampi than those in more temperate areas, where food is likely easier to find in the winter and cached food is less important to survival. But here's where it gets really interesting. In the early autumn, black-capped chickadees allow brain neurons containing old information to die and replaces them with new neurons. These new neurons help them adapt to changes in their social flocks and environment, and also to facilitate growth in the hippocampus. Because the size of the hippocampus of black-capped chickadees also varies throughout the year. It's largest in October and smallest in February. Now, the exact reason for this change is unknown, but it's thought that the hippocampus grows to allow the chickadee to remember its cache locations and then shrinks as these caches are used up. How amazing is that? Okay, now let's turn our attention to another common bird to see at feeders, especially in the winter again, the nuthatch. There are 29 species of nuthatch, and they're distributed worldwide, but there are only 4 species in the United States. But again, they're all behaviorally pretty similar. The brown-headed nuthatch is primarily found in the southeastern U.S. The pygmy nuthatch ranges through various parts of western North America, from southern British Columbia through the Rocky Mountains and into central Mexico. The red-breasted nuthatch inhabits the conifer forests of the Rocky Mountains, Pacific Northwest, and Canada. But what's interesting about red-breasted nuthatch is that in winter they often migrate what's called eruptively. Not necessarily because of a lack of food like other migratory species, but I guess just because they can. In fact, red-breasted nuthatches migrate southward earlier than many other eruptive species. They might start heading south in early July, reaching their southernmost point by September or October. And then there's the much more common white-breasted nuthatch, which is found year-round across most of the United States, Mexico, and southern Canada. I'm going to focus on these last two, the red-breasted and white-breasted nuthatches, since those are the ones you're most likely to spot at your feeder. Like chickadees, nuthatches are small birds. It has a black crown on its head, a white breast and underparts in the case of the white-breasted nuthatch, rusty red in the case of the red-breasted nuthatch, but both have slate gray and black wings and tail. But one of the easiest ways to identify any nuthatch is by the way it perches. While chickadees and most other birds sit on top of a branch perched upright, nuthatches will often cling to either the bottom of a branch upside down or to the side of a tree or feeder, but head down towards the ground and tail pointed skyward. Unlike woodpeckers that use their tails for extra support, nuthatches rely on their strong legs and feet to support them. Their calls are pretty recognizable too. The call of the white-breasted nuthatch is said to sound like a laugh or a giggle. The red-breasted nuthatch's call is similar, but different enough that you can differentiate between the two of them. Like chickadees, nuthatches are omnivorous, eating insects and seeds. In summer, they hunt for insects by hopping headfirst down the tree trunk. I've heard a saying that nuthatches catch going down what the woodpecker missed going up. And like chickadees, out of obvious necessity in most of their range, in winter, seeds make up a larger percent of their diet, up to 70%, which is why you're likely to see them at your feeder in the winter. Large seeds or nuts are jammed into crevices in tree bark, and then the bird whacks them with its sharp bill in order to hatch the seed from inside, hence the name nuthatch. Surplus seeds are cached under loose bark or crevices of trees. In winter, nuthatches join foraging flocks led by chickadees or titmice, partly because it makes it easier to find food, and partly because more birds means more eyes watching out for predators. One study found that removing titmice from a flock made nuthatches more wary and less willing to visit exposed bird feeders. Nuthatch pairs tend to stay together year-round, but when the male is alone, he has to spend more time watching for predators. The female nuthatch, on the other hand, has to put up with her mate pushing her out of prime foraging sites, so when he's around, she spends more time watching out for him than she does for predators. Nuthatches are another cavity nesting bird, and they're very territorial, especially during the nesting season, chasing away other cavity nesters. While red-breasted nuthatches often excavate their own cavities, white-breasted nuthatches rarely do, preferring instead to occupy an existing cavity or enlarge a woodpecker hole. This also means that red-breasted nuthatches rarely occupy nesting boxes, but white-breasted nuthatches sometimes will. White-breasted nuthatches also are known to return to the same cavity they used the previous year. But as is often the case, it's ladies' choice when it comes to nesting sites, though unmated males may start to excavate several cavities in their territory to try and attract a mate. Once the site is chosen, both sexes excavate the cavity, although the female tends to do more of the work while the male brings her food. But here's the coolest thing about red-breasted nuthatches. Both sexes collect globs of resin from pine trees and plaster them around the entrance to the nest hole. The male puts the resin primarily on the outside of the nest hole, the female primarily around the inside. They might carry the resin in their bill or on pieces of bark that they'll then use as an applicator. The reason? Well, the theory is that this resin helps keep out predators or competitors, and I'm guessing probably ants that can be problematic in the nest too. The nuthatches avoid the resin themselves by diving directly through the hole. And with that, my feral friends, we're going to wrap up this episode. Go clean and fill your bird feeders and appreciate the amazing, not to mention adorable, chickadees and nuthatches that will come to call. If you want to support the podcast, there's several ways to do that. You can become a patron. To become a patron, navigate yourself to patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get some sweet Dispatches from the Forest merch. And I want to welcome my newest patron, the Sauls family. Thank you guys so much for becoming patrons. If you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can do that through PayPal using my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. For the Cash App, you can use the hashtag ForestNerd. You can also use that email address to contact me for other stuff like questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes. Check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatches from the forest. Then click on products and you'll see all the fun stuff we have to offer there. You can also follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, where you can find the Feral Final Friday webinar about coyote myths that I did last week, and you can watch that there for free. So if you missed it, and I kind of know you did, go give it a watch. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.